Thank you to everyone for the great presentations. It's been extremely informative. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much to Juan Carlos for making my job much easier, because what I'll be talking about is expressed in an outcome as demonstrated by Walmart. I can only imagine the amount of management resources, brain power, and costs and expenses that have been incurred in order to implement such a comprehensive and really fantastic food loss and food waste program. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how to get the private sector to care about and to engage in issues of food loss and in food waste. Our company is specialized in this. As you kindly noted, I'm a serial entrepreneur, and we take a very entrepreneurial approach to the development problems that we try to address in our organization. And one of the most important things we try to do is understand how business, in our case, we focus a lot on small businesses in emerging markets. We focus on food logistics infrastructure in emerging markets, how to get them, small businesses in the private sector, to be engaged on development sector interest and development sector outcome in a way that also meets the interest of the private sector. Our example we're going to talk about is a cold storage refrigeration facility that we recently opened in Morocco that's related to food loss and food waste reduction. And we're going to talk about development sector interest. We're going to talk about corporate social responsibility, and we're going to talk about private sector engagement and how to bring this axis of energy and resource together to attack, reduce, and improve food loss and food waste. So we'll start with our example of a project that we took on as our own CSR, and I'll explain why, obligation. We were commissioned by USAID, we have offices in Casablanca in Morocco, to look at the post-harvest agricultural value chain at several value chains in northern Morocco to identify ways to reduce food losses along these agricultural value chains. While there were several examples, the most stark was along the strawberry value chain. A lot of money has gone into Morocco in the past 10 years because it's a great location to grow strawberries to produce berries broadly. Berries are a very high value export product and also freeze very well and can then be exported as individually quick frozen, and that allows actually a lower quality of strawberry to be retained for export and stored for the long term. What we saw when we started looking at this particular value chain was you had individually quick frozen producers who were accepting strawberries from smallholder farmers in northern Morocco. They would process them through the morning. They had relatively limited on-site storage, and as soon as that on-site storage was filled, they had to turn the processing lines off. And they would be turning off processing lines around noon, 1 in the afternoon, and the rest of the smallholder farmers who were trying to deliver product on that day were out of luck. And it was a waste of strawberries in an enormous quantity because they couldn't take it and sell it on the local market. The prices were depressed because everyone was trying to sell on the local market at that point of harvest, so effectively these strawberries were being wasted. The solution that we identified was, well, there was a clear need for additional storage capacity in northern Morocco, but there was not a way to do storage capacity just for this single value chain of strawberries. So we had to then look broadly at a variety of value chains to figure out how do we provide storage capacity to the value chain of strawberries, but also provide services from a private sector perspective to a broader cross-section of value chains and also a broader set of importers and exporters in order to make sure that we can amortize and justify the investments and costs associated with an investment in a cold storage facility. So we thought about that. We continued our research analysis. We identified a solution was to build a trade logistics hub at a northern port in Morocco called Tangier Med, which was in a free trade area within the port that allowed rapid access for the IQF producers to move product out of their cold stores on site into our facility to allow continued processing over the course of the day for the strawberry producers. From our perspective, the funding we had from USAID was limited only to the development of an investment concept around setting up, first identifying the investment opportunities, then to develop an investment concept around setting up this trade logistics hub. We said to USAID, well, here's your PDF. I hope someone works with it. And it was clear that based on that PDF alone and that business case alone, there wasn't enough substance there to justify a private sector actor to come in and build this facility. So I sat with my partners and we sat with USAID and said, listen, we think this is a real investment opportunity. We want to take it forward, but we want to take it forward on our own account, but it's probably going to be a net loss for us. And so we decided from a CSR perspective, we were going to move this forward to achieve a demonstration effect project and say, listen, this can be done. This is the development impact. And for us, it demonstrates what we do as an organization. So we actually developed this project, which is a private sector project. It is funded 100% with a joint venture structure. We're investors in it. We have Spanish investors and we have local Moroccan investors to achieve a clear development outcome. But we used CSR resources, our own internal resources, to develop the project. And it's this thinking about having a problem, which in this case was reducing post-harvest food loss along an agricultural value chain in northern Morocco, combined with a CSR angle, combined with a private sector interest, our joint venture partners who are invested in the project, to deliver an impactful investment to mitigate food loss and food waste. So we're going to talk about two things. The first is how to align interest amongst the multi-stakeholder approach, including private sector, including development, including non-governmental, including local stakeholders. And then once those interests have been aligned, figuring out a way and a methodology to align the resources that are at our collective disposal from a multi-stakeholder approach to achieve the implementation or the investment measures necessary to reduce post-harvest loss or food waste lost. To achieve an alignment of interest, one has to identify the stakeholders, and one needs to approach with a very nuanced approach how to align these interests. And then from a alignment of resources to understand which resources each of the stakeholders can bring to bear, and then get those resources aligned and also sequenced in a way that you go from the identification of the food loss and food waste problem to an implementation, if that is an investment in logistics, if that's an investment in software systems, if that's an investment in facilities, whatever that implementation may be, there's a resource cost for that implementation, and aligning and sequencing those resources using what's available to the stakeholders. So first we'll talk about thinking in terms of aligning interest. In this Venn diagram, we're looking at development actors, other stakeholders. That could be local unions, it could be agricultural cooperatives, it could be producers, it could be suppliers, it could be a lot of different stakeholders. Then you have the private sector interest. Then you also have government actors. The key is to find that sweet spot, and it's very small sometimes, but it's typically there if you look hard enough and understand it. And bringing these stakeholders together to a table and using CSR, which is a very multidisciplinary tool within the context of what corporations can bring to bear to address food loss and food waste, to realize that alignment of interest and catalyze those investments, catalyze those implementation measures that can be highly impactful. So I've got two simple examples. And I've actually seen these two examples at a negotiating table with different stakeholders. So in the first example on the top, we have a broader development goal, which is reducing food loss and food waste at the point of sale to improve caloric availability. Private sector interest in this case is not really about improving caloric availability, it's really about reducing losses. That's what they care about. The government interest is sometimes completely abstracted away from the two issues. They have a climate mitigation measure goal they're trying to meet that can actually be addressed with the development goal and the private sector goal. So at the first level of interest, in the darkened boxes, there's not a clear alignment of interest. But when you look at a CSR program perspective, you can bring these interests together by improving post-harvest cold treatment, because improved post-harvest cold treatment, as Juan Carlos already demonstrated, extends product shelf life. And if you're extending product shelf life at your point of sale, that's improving caloric availability, that's reducing food prices. It's also a climate mitigation measure, and it reduces losses for the private sector. And it's important to understand that if you have a first level discussion about interests, all the parties will look at each other and no one will understand each other. And there will be no alignment of interest. But it's understanding that secondary interest. The next example is the development goal is to collect food from restaurants to provide food, high quality food, to pregnant women to improve neonatal health outcomes. Great development goal, great program. Private sector interest, they want to reduce garbage collection bills. Government interest, they want to win votes from pregnant women. And I've seen negotiations fall apart because the development actors really want the private sector to care about their issue, which in this case is improving maternal health care outcomes. The private sector in this case really cares about it from an emotional perspective, and that's a great thing to service a community, but that's not going to mobilize private sector resources. Instead, it's getting to that secondary level of alignment of interest, which is we want to mobilize restaurants to participate in food collection, and we can all agree on that, and we agree on it because it's going to achieve the development goal of improving health outcomes, it's going to improve the private sector goal, which is reducing garbage collection bills, and it's going to improve the government interest, which is winning votes, and if you have improved neonatal health care outcomes, you have reduced educational costs because you have children who have not had micronutrient deficiency. Everyone can agree on that secondary level, but they won't necessarily agree on that primary alignment of interest. Now the question is, assuming that from a multi-stakeholder approach, you have an alignment of interest. You agree that there is, for example, an improved post-harvest cold treatment program to be implemented that will achieve the development outcomes, that will achieve post-harvest loss reduction and food waste loss reduction. Well, you're going to need some money for that. You're going to need some capital, you're going to need some management resources, you're going to need private sector to be engaged, you're going to need private sector to care because they're handling these resources. So you have to understand, once we've aligned interest, you have to understand what then motivates different groups and also what resources are available. Things that motivate private sector, a risk-adjusted rate of return. Sorry, you can't see my slide. There we go. The motivating factor for private sector is risk-adjusted rate of return. How do I make money on a project? And is that amount of money I'm planning on making appropriate for the amount of risk I'm taking? And when you think about a country like Nigeria, where the government bond issuances are priced at over 20%, which is the local risk-free rate, and this is corporate finance talk, but it is extraordinarily difficult to justify private sector investment in that kind of capital cost environment. So risk-adjusted rate of return is very important. Time value of money is very important to the private sector. And we all know there's a huge need for capacity building and technical assistance for whatever projects are being implemented by the private sector. So let's look at the next bullet point, which is what resources are available. Development programming frequently has the ability to provide resources in terms of research, reports can be provided. These are soft investments that can be provided, but they're investments and they're valuable nonetheless. Development can also provide technical capacity building and technical assistance to private sector projects, also frequently offered and frequently very impactful when delivered appropriately at the appropriate point of time in a private sector investment. DFIs can occasionally provide funding for engineering studies or environmental studies. Governments can reduce time to market through accelerated permitting processes or accelerated regulatory improvements. And CSR is, if you will, a multidisciplinary resource provider that can provide a lot of different resources along the axis of developing a project to help support that project through its development phase and then into its implementation. And CSR can connect a lot of these resources. And I'll explain further on the next slide. What I'm showing here on this slide, if you start on the right-hand side where you see the 0, we're describing an investment process or the implementation of a food loss or food waste measure. And if you start out on the right, if you're looking at it on your left, you identify the food loss and food waste problem. Then you move to the financial market and technical definition of the problem. You have to do engineering and environmental studies. You need to license whatever you want to build or whatever you want to implement. Then you need to take it to market, build it, and there's always an ongoing technical assistance need. Along that axis, you have a curve, two S-curves. One is the net present value. One is an internal rate of return curve. And the private sector will engage with its financial resources once the net present value meets a certain threshold and once the internal rate of return meets a certain threshold. From a food loss and food waste perspective, we have clearly identified in this room, moving out to the left, that there is a need to reduce food waste, and food losses. From a CSR perspective, we can look at what Walmart's done to identify a variety of different solutions. Then you move into DFIs who can potentially provide support for some of the engineering or some of the environmental studies required to implement such a measure or to build the facilities required to implement these measures. You can work with the local government on accelerated permitting or the regulatory reform. And then finally, the development actors have the ability to provide ongoing technical assistance and capacity building once that implementation measure, once that investment measure has been put in place. And along this development axis, you have a high risk at the beginning and a lower risk at the end and an increase of value. And when that meets a certain threshold of reduced risk and increased value, that's when really private sector money and resource engagement can be made possible. The challenge in emerging markets is really aligning these resources in a way that engages the private sector. To summarize, food loss and food waste issues have different meanings and consequences for different stakeholders. Finding that alignment of interest is possible, but it's nuanced, and it's not always first-level interest, maybe secondary, maybe third-level interest. The second takeaway is catalyzing the investment or the private sector resource engagement around food loss and food waste does not necessarily mean more resources, more money, more capital. It means aligning those resources from the development actors, governmental actors, other stakeholders, and private sector in a way that in a process-oriented approach can actually catalyze the necessary engagement. Thank you very much.